Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Vinay Hebar. I'm the managing director for Harvard Business Publishing and have the pleasure of moderating this wonderful panel this afternoon. So the topic for our discussion is realigning institutions, and really we are talking about institutional reforms. And the way I'm framing it is institutional reforms as opposed to economic reforms. So we're talking about reforms of government and policy making bodies that are needed to address the challenges to India's growth and competitiveness. You know, globally, billions of dollars are spent in trying to improve and reform governments. And by the assessment of the multilateral agencies that are funding a lot of these, 70% of these reforms have very little impact. All that they end up doing is creating new laws that are not implemented, or creating new bodies to ostensibly measure impact and deliver these reforms, and these bodies end up either being not funded or understaffed, or you have budgets that are underused. And Indian institutions have not been very different so far. You know, we had the first generation reforms, which again, you know, the world started economic reforms, many parts of the world in 1960s. India followed, or rather had to follow, in the early 90s, and even then within the Congress party there was a lot of opposition. I remember a newspaper article that said, and this was the party's own paper, which said, this is going to achieve nothing for the middle class besides get fizzier colas and crispier cornflakes. So there was widespread skepticism then, but we all know that it has helped India in many ways in the last 2 decades. And in the 90s, many parts of the world went on to implement radical reforms in governance. And India's lagged behind there, and maybe the time has come. The importance of these institutional reforms are undeniable. There is a newfound enthusiasm everywhere. We're talking about the Make in India campaign. Our prime minister's in New York right now and being felicitated like a rock star. So there's a lot of enthusiasm. But on the other hand, the dampening reality is India ranks approximately 60th in World Bank's ranking of competitiveness. That's the reality. And a lot needs to be done on the institutional architecture to help us climb these rankings. So without much ado, I'm going to move to our panel to really understand the challenges with respect to institutional reforms, and more importantly, what some of the solutions could be. So David, I may start with you. You know, just to lay context, what is the role institutions play in competitiveness of a country? And whose interest do these institutions serve?
Right. That's the question I want to address, because as we all know from those rankings, India scores lower on competitiveness, and one of the issues that's often cited as why we score low is because the inefficiency of our institutions, the fact that they don't deliver. The question that I said I would ask is, whose interests are served by our institutions? And I want to propose that there are 3 possible answers. 2 of them will destroy competitiveness, 1 of them will enable. I settled in India 6.5 years ago. I'm Indian by choice. Yet one of the things that surprised me shifting here from US was the pervasive nature of the bureaucracy. My motto is keep me away from the babus. And what I discovered was that in many cases it seemed that the government institutions were designed to serve the government. That, you created a political class, you created a class of babus and government employees. It's sort of like in many African countries, the state is considered the plum job. In US, it's considered somewhat noble. You're supposed to be sacrificial if you go into civil service. But here, young people say, oh, get me a government job. I want to work in the government. It's secure, it's high salaries, relatively speaking. Government school teachers are happy. So what I came to know was there's sort of a self-serving class of regulators, administrators, ministry officers, and that even, especially the political sector. Forgive me, I tend to be a little bit provocative when I speak, but I think when seeing the movement of I am Ana, me Ana hu, you know, and seeing what has happened in the last wave of elections and being a Delhi resident and seeing what happened with Aam Aadmi Party, there's a sense that I'm not just being provocative, my fellow Indians see it the same way, that the government seemed to exist to support the political class rather than the political class seeming to support the population. So what that happened was, as I learned many years ago in business school, government is inherently economically inefficient. Let me repeat that. Government, anytime government gets involved, it introduces a degree of economic inefficiency. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. We need government, we should invest in that inefficiency for certain social ends. But economically speaking, government inherently reduces efficiency and therefore reduces competitiveness. So what we have traditionally had in India is the resources of the institutions were promoting the political class. Second, the resources of the institutions have been often devoted to the interests of entrenched businesses. What is this coal scandal? What was the 2G scandal? Okay, what is the decision under the Mayawati government that kept Reliance Fresh out of UP? It was serving the interests of entrenched business. What is the question, shall we have 49% FDI in certain industries? The idea is to protect entrenched business interests. This is not a value judgment, not saying good or bad, it's just a fact. And there are political reasons to do it. You want the support of the Kiranawalas, you keep the Reliance Fresh out. You want to support the development. Singapore did it, Korea did it, they all protected their domestic. Not a value judgment. However, what happens when you protect entrenched business industries is you foster uncompetitiveness. They learn that they can get by with the protection of the government. They don't have to compete against the French, the Germans, the Brits, the Americans, the Japanese, the Singaporeans. So two things tend to hinder competitiveness in our institutions. Only when institutions are designed to serve this third group, which I call customers. That can be the public at large, that can be the people who want to do business here, that can be any other stakeholder group. When, and as we heard from Mark earlier, it's about creating value for others. A good example, one of the Emirates, I don't know if it was Abu Dhabi or Dubai, I actually, my memory for details is bad. The Emir made a decision and he told the government, he told the ministers, you have to deliver business permits in 1 day. All required business permits for a new investment have to be delivered in 1 day. Can you imagine that happening in India? That I want to start a business and I can get all the required clearances in 1 day? Can you imagine ever happening in India? But he made it happen in his country. Now he's the emir, he's like the owner of the place. He's like a CEO, so he could make it happen. But you ask, why is it hard to do business in India? Okay, because the goal is not making it easier for the customer. I'm optimistic about the Ab Ki Baar Modi Sarkar. The talk is all very good, and I hope we have a great success in improving the value helping instead of the competitive hindering.
Thank you, David. Professor Rishi, why is there a need for institutional reforms, in specific terms? And how badly broken are our institutions? Do you agree that when David says that, wherever there is government, by definition there is inefficiency and loss of value, if I have to paraphrase what David implied?
Now, I guess any good institutional system needs to have checks and balances. That's the entire principle behind a good governance system. And in India, I think there are some important things we need to make sure that the institutional structure protects. For example, we all know that in any good capitalist system, one of the most important things is that property rights have to be protected. And here I'm not talking about esoteric property rights like intellectual property. I'm just talking about basic property rights, including land, buildings, etc. I think the second important thing we also know from looking at history is that you need to have independent bodies who can intervene in disputes. So one important manifestation of this, of course, is the legal system, but it could also be a good set of arbitrators or any other dispute resolution mechanism. And we also know a third thing, that for this to function effectively, the executive and this dispute resolution mechanism, or let's say the executive and the judiciary, need to be separate from each other. And they should not be one and the same. So to my way of thinking, perhaps the most important institutional reform at this point of time is to make sure that we have a very strong legal system and that we reinforce the rule of law. The rule of law is something which ensures that everybody gets treated equally, so that you don't have the kind of rent-seeking behavior that David was just speaking about. The rule of law also ensures that people's disputes get settled expeditiously, so that people don't try to take advantage of the legal system and try to, just push judgments and decisions for years on end, and therefore the entrenched interests who know how the legal system works can work it to their advantage. So I think if we really want to create a good playing field for business in India, if we want to make India more competitive, we really must make sure that we have good, strong legal system which will be able to create a kind of dispute resolution mechanism for anybody who's doing business. And I think unless we have that, we really won't be able to build the kind of competitive infrastructure we want.
Thank you. Anurag ji, as a part of the system, I'd like to get your perspective on how badly do you think the institutions are broken today, and also, on the positive side, what is working as far as Indian institutions are concerned? What strengths can we take as we look at further reforms?
Well, thank you. I think the first thing I should say is that I'm not part of the system anymore. Since I met Amit 3 weeks ago, I've completed my term in
So you can
competition commission. So I
give
am
an outsider view
my
then.
own person and better place to answer your question than I would have been as member. I think, let me just give you a governance perspective as I see in institutional reforms. Many infrastructures were mentioned in the morning, physical, emotional, spiritual. But I think we need to add another infrastructure, which is what you're talking about, is the institutional infrastructure. And my view is that I think that is something which needs to get far more priority than it has been getting so. In fact, you mentioned some of the reforms in India. And this word administrative reforms, as a person, I've never liked it. Because of historical reasons, administrative reforms in India is treated as something, well, it's not going to happen. And you only have commissions which give 12-volume, 16-volume reports, nothing happens. So I prefer the word governance reforms, which is what you used. Okay, now what is institutional infrastructure? To my mind, institutional infrastructure is the set of laws, policies, and institutions which define and deliver governance. See, that is what it is. I mean, if you have the right institutional infrastructure, I don't think any of these things will happen which have been mentioned, rightly so. I don't think one needs to talk about what is wrong with the governance system today or what is not the way it should be. I think everybody knows it. As an individual, as a citizen, each one of us has felt that the governance impinging on us, not in the way we would like. The thing as an insider for 42 years before I completed my term with the government in various capacities since 1972 is that there are a lot of people within the systems who are extremely good. And I'm very fond of, I read something, a book Arun Shuri wrote. He must have written 2 decades ago and I must have read it a decade ago. I remember nothing of it, except one thing. In every system, look for the marginal man who is trying to fight and set things right and support that marginal man. Now, what I find in a system, and I've gone through the system and tried to do what I could, is very little support for the marginal man. And when you fight it from within, you know it is, how it is. There's Again, people talk of out-of-the-box ideas, innovation. But in this system, do people really want out-of-the-box ideas? No, my experience is they want to kill it in the first instance. It makes people feel very insecure. And therefore, all your administrative reforms efforts are based on best practices. Now, best practices and out-of-the-box ideas, by definition, contradict each other. Out of the box is something new. Prime Minister said 3 days ago, innovation is something, a leap in the dark, something which has never been done before and is inherently risk-taking. Best practices, the definition is something which has been done elsewhere and just copy it. And what are bureaucratic systems designed for? They are designed for year after year, decades after decades, fail safe. Don't make a mistake. It doesn't matter because you achieve anything or not. It's not going to matter. But if you fail, you have it. But there are a lot of people in the system who's fighting it. And let me also give a couple of positive examples where system supports. You know, when on 7th of January 2009, as Secretary Ministry of Corporate Affairs, I received a mail from Chairman Sebi forwarding me Ramalinga Raju's mail saying basically that a $1.5 billion fraud has been committed. And I received a Secretary, Corporate Affairs, which actually is meant to investigate such things. I think to myself at night when I got the time to think, because the whole day was media and the whole lot, I said to myself, do I only investigate? What happens to the company? What happens to its 50,000 employees and their families? What happens to the economy of the country? What happens to the IT sector in the company? And that is, you remember, the time of gloom and doom. So, I mean, how would it be used against India? I said, no, we must save it. No, but how? I have no power. It's not government's role. I thought something to myself. I said, I talked to my minister at 8 in the morning. I rang him up. I said, I think we should try to save it. And I think I know how to save it. He had great faith in me. We had worked together for 2.5 years. He said, Anurag, go ahead. He didn't ask me many details, very pragmatic person. He said, just wait for 20 minutes. I'll get back to you. And he spoke to, I don't want to share with you, but in such an exercise, the highest levels must be involved from the beginning. At 8:25, I got the clearance that less than 24 hours, governmental system had decided to make an attempt. And there was no law which gave me the power to do anything. So what do? I find out somewhere in the Companies Act a section which had never been used before for going to the Company Law Board, which had the power to dissolve the board and set up a board. The rest is history, you know. We got people like Deepak Parekh, Kiran Karnik and all that. Each one handpicked. What I'm trying to say, things can work. There are a lot of people who are wanting to work. I mean, I've given an anecdotal example. If you want later on, I can tell you a systems model, a governance model, which I have not shared with anybody so far, but on which I have worked. It works. And why did it work? Because 3 years I had already reinvented the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. What was occasional if you were to send, in fact, IIM Ahmedabad wanted to send somebody, I had said no. If you study it, or Harvard, if you study it, it is how you read. In fact, in Harvard, I had gone to Harvard, I presented that case in a course I had gone to. The point I'm making is there are a lot of positives in the Indian system, there are a lot of positive people, and like David, I'm very positive with the kind of leadership and the kind of mindset which is coming, it will happen. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great story. Let me move to Girija. You know, there's momentum, there is need. In many cases, the solutions are blindingly obvious, but yet government after government has achieved little in the way of administrative reforms, to use a word. Sorry, I know it's not a word you like, but governance reforms. What do you see as the barriers to this? What's slowing us down or stopping implementation of these?
I think that the basic issue, even at the policy making level or at the institutions level, the organizational level in India is setting up low benchmarks and low targets. See, we always are fine with an incremental change, a moderate change and an incremental change, but we do not really even think at the big change. I think at least presently I find that the present government is having that approach of looking at a bigger change than ever before, or something like a both leap in terms of quantity and quality. I think this is one of the fundamental issues. If you look at a very strategic perspective, what actually affects India's endeavor into institutional reforms. I think, having said that, I would personally say that the areas where absolutely very little focus has been there is one of them is skill development, and another thing, important thing where we do not pay much attention is streamlining these purchase processes, which actually and government, for all of us, we know the government is the biggest procurement body. It procures a lot of services and goods, and there also a lot of inefficiency both in terms of quality and other things are there. These are the two areas, and added to that, if we can look at agreeing on some common areas, say for example, take the states. Each state has different laws on relating to land. Each state has different laws relating to the state level taxations, and so on and so forth. That the development, regional development as such, is also getting affected. And if an investor from outside wants to set up 4-5 plants in different places, he has to understand 4 or 5 things separately. That kind of uniformity and certain common minimum agreement has to be reached across the states. In a formal manner. When I'm saying states, I don't mean political parties. I mean governments of the states. As soon as they form, they should come together and say that yes, we are. And somebody has to tell them, okay, this part, there is no politics on this. Same thing as far as the national level is concerned. On certain areas of policy and development, we need to have some common approach. And we need to look at quality as a focus, skill as a focus, and a constant and yearning focus on setting higher targets all the time. Really a different way of looking at targets itself.
Wonderful. Thank you. Nagi, let me come to you. We are all fresh from the Make in India launch yesterday, and the drive to provide an impetus to manufacturing in India. In terms of institutional reforms, what is it going to take in your view to move this from a good catch line to reality?
Right. I think I share everybody's optimism in terms of the opportunity that exists in front of us for Make in India and the But I think at the core of it, we have to be competitive for manufacturing. It won't come because we want it. People won't invest because we have an opportunity. I think we have to enable the opportunity. And it's a big subject, but I want to sort of pick up one thread around education. Having been a beneficiary of education both in the United States and India, and working in the United States and India, and there's some very stark differences in terms of what's stifling, I think, us. I think Mark mentioned, leave aside the opportunity. I think there are some red flags in the system, in my view. I think Mark mentioned the peacock to the duster. I saw that happen in Detroit. I think I can see potentially that's happening in the automotive sector here with domestic makers if they don't innovate. And, innovation comes it's not just skills, but you need a very strong education infrastructure and train people at scale to be able to innovate at the scale at which we want to innovate. And haven't seen that yet. If you look at our education system, the university system, while I don't have great expertise, I've watched it somewhat closely. I think the one big piece missing in the entire system is autonomy. If you look at, and autonomy for education institutions, I think are in 3 buckets. There's sort of governance autonomy. If you look at the United States, if you look at the way universities are run, they do it at scale. 2,200 universities, most of them pretty good. We have, how many of our universities are ranked in the top? And there's some fundamental differences. If you look at governance autonomy that I mentioned, look at the way heads of institutions are appointed in the public university system. It's often politicized, It's often, along lines that generally probably not always lack merit. If you look at private institutions, I think the private institutions have done well. I mean, it's a bit of a good news in terms of driving undergraduate education. But that's not enough for innovation. I think undergraduate education, if you look at the numbers, people can argue whether good quality, bad quality, at least there are numbers. But they haven't scaled beyond the undergraduate. Where is the real sort of research-based innovation? I think Deborah mentioned you have to nurture talent, you have to nurture innovation, and that you need the national labs to work with the university system. I mean, that's missing completely. Today, if a corporate entity even wants to set up an R&D lab and hire PhDs and drive innovation, they can't find the candidates, right? So that's one, governance autonomy. Second is financial autonomy. I think you mentioned procurement processes. Even in the public institutions, the way they procure, the funding agency shows up to decide what they're going to procure and how they're going to procure. And it stifles the system, and not to dwell on all this too much. And third is academic autonomy. To be able to hire people, hire the faculty you want. And if you want to be world class, you have to pay them world class, and not have salary structures and norms that just completely stifle. So there's some pretty fundamental issues. So I can't connect the dots between wanting to do and how we will do without some pretty fundamental reforms in the education system. And I think let me leave it at that, given the time, but we can.
Sure, thank you. Taking off from when Agi left it on education, Rishi, I'd like to get your perspective on it, because on one hand, we have talent shortage in India as it is, even before this whole Make in India campaign is reality. On the other hand, we know there is a lot of unemployment amongst youth, both real as well as disguised. How do we break this unfortunate situation? What reforms would you see as required?
No, I think India has an interesting paradox. The paradox is there are lots of people looking for jobs and unable to get them. There are a lot of organizations looking for people to employ and they are not able to get them. And then never the twain shall meet. So this, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have today, that we simply seem to be unable to match the requirements of organizations and the kind of skills we give people. Part of this is, of course, related to the fact that many curricula are outdated, many institutions are not run well, they don't update things regularly and so on. But I must say that it's also a problem on the employer side. Many employers are not willing to bring skilled people into the workforce. They're quite happy to work with people who are less skilled and will cost less, because the assumption is that the less skilled person's lower costs will translate into a competitive advantage. If I can just take a minute to share a simple story. Many of you might know that Bharat Forge is today one of India's top exporters, also one of the most successful companies in the automotive components sector. Something like 15 years ago, in the late 1980s, they made a big, it's more than that, it's 20 years ago, they made a big transition where they decided to replace their unskilled workforce by a skilled workforce, shift from a lot of manual activities to automation, and all of this was driven by quality. And this, which they thought might actually add to their costs, finally in the ultimate analysis, it actually lowered their cost, improved their quality, and allowed them to access global markets. So this is a kind of, it's a transition of the way the entrepreneur or the company itself thinks, where they have to realize that, just making that shift to a higher skilled workforce will actually result in better productivity and enable you to really access the market better. So I think there's also an issue on the demand side. It's not only just creating skilled people. You need transitions on both ends.
Sure. Would you like to add to that?
I think the one framework that should work well is public-private partnerships. I mean, I think that has worked really well in the US. And I think to get this turbocharge, I don't think it's the government's fault completely. I don't think it's the companies. But we have to find ways for the private sector to lubricate this innovation engine with a need that drives the supply of sort of skills and development. I mean, I think that has to happen.
Can I add a word about education? I've launched an initiative, forgive me for being a little bit ambitious. It's called University 4.0, and the goal is nothing short of making Indian higher education #1 in the world. So I hope, do you think we can do it? Anyway, but you exactly put out the issue, this institutional focus. Whom does our higher education institution serve? Well, it has been told to me that many of the institutes are in the hands of politicians. So the government maintains a monopoly on accreditation. Who accredits in US? Consortia of colleges. Government doesn't accredit. They determine their own standards. So there's freedom. You can compete. You can try alternative models. Okay? Whom does the industry serve? Government says it should not be for profit. It should be a noble enterprise. Wonderful, honorable goal. But as Nagia has pointed out, so you mean keep the salaries low and just find sants who are willing to come and teach the students? No, if you want the best people, you have to pay more. So the whole focus of the education industry is basically self-serving and just to give diploma mills. Students come through our system basically to get their ticket punched. See, I have a degree, hire me. And it doesn't produce value. I'm horrified how ill-prepared our graduates are. We have some wonderful graduates, we have some excellent schools, but by and large, only 1 out of 4 Indian graduates is considered employable. So if we change the who is it going to serve, if we free it up, give more autonomy, change the institutional structure, we will change the results. If we keep the institutional structure, I'd like to say I could be optimistic, but it wouldn't be true.
Girija, let me move from education to insurance. Today, insurance is accessible to a small sliver of our population. And there are attempts like the recent Jan Dhan Yojana to percolate that down. But really, from your perspective, what policy actions or reforms do you see as required to make it accessible to the marginal man, to borrow the phrase?
Yeah, it's right that insurance, has an issue for distribution. Basically, insurance is not fully known to people. So, importance of insurance and insurance awareness is less. So that needs to be kind of brought in. And what is important is that I think the way we are looking at, say, for example, health insurance, the penetration levels of every insurance business, especially in general insurance, is very, very low. 0.8% of the GDP, which is absolutely low. It is in our interest to see that it goes up to at least 2 to 3% of the GDP. See, the issue is about distribution, creating an awareness in the customer, and creating certain infrastructural facility which perhaps cannot happen in isolation. For example, on health insurance, a lot of coming together is required by various stakeholders, namely the service providers, the hospitals, the insurance companies, the third-party administrators, see, for example, today I don't have clearly any regulation for hospitals. Either for the facilities, minimum facilities, standardization, and such things. This institutional support is required through certain enactment, certain legislative support. As far as actually taking the insurance to the doorstep of the common man is concerned, a lot of effort has gone into that. Take, for example, my own company, National Insurance Company, we have this insurance on wheels, where we have in 15 cities. We would like to go to every place outside the bigger cities, outskirts, and reach out to the customers. But technology is the biggest game changer. In fact, we are looking at using technology such that, especially the mobile technology, to see that this shortcoming in terms of distribution is overcome. And we have a long way to go because I'm sure that as far as areas like health insurance are concerned, there is going to be a lot of activity even at the policy making level, because that has become a important, well recognized need of the country, and I'm sure that that has to happen. But lot of reform of institutions, both within the insurance sector as well as outside, more importantly the outside, is very, very much required, for which we require enablement from the policy making.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to Q&A, there was, a big part of these reforms are about execution and coordination. And Anuragji, I want to get your perspective on this. There are a lot of investments that have come in, but stuck at various stages, especially infrastructure projects, power projects. And a lot of this is to do with lack of coordination between different government bodies and policy bodies. What do you see, very quickly in a minute, what do you see as possible solutions to this?
Well, a minute to answer this kind of question. See, I think for this you need to, I'm giving you an institutional answer, not a specific to individual thing. For this you need to go beyond realigning the institutions to synergizing the institutions. Now synergizing, if you want a one-word answer, though I like to expand on it a little bit, it's a mindset issue. You see, in governance, if you want a single word, it's a mindset is the issue. The rest will follow, all structures, all bodies, all institutions, who does what and all that. And I think David got it very well. He says, whom do we serve? As an administrator for 40 years, what I ask, what makes him tick? What makes this person tick? What makes this institution tick? What is he looking for? Whom is he serving? So long as you serve yourself, it's not going to happen. So how do you create structures which tend to create checks and balances and energize people? Now I'll give you another minute. See, I have developed a practitioner's model of governance. It took me 30 years plus to develop it. I've been using it for the last 10 years. I still have to get an IPR on it, and this is the first time I'm sharing it in public. I call it, in the practitioner model, there are 4 components. It is a building model. You build, those who destroy are good, but you must know how to build before you destroy. So first is building laws and policies. That's the first level. Second level is building institutions and systems. That's the second level. Third is building people and processes. And the fourth level, and to my mind is extremely key level, which we constantly tend to miss, is building partnerships. The partnership is the key. That is how you get everybody together. That's why I talk of synergizing, I talk of partnership. And all this, underlying all this, what you do, is that mindset and innovation. I'll give you a couple of examples, though it will exceed your 1 minute. Take a district administration, and there's a session in the afternoon on district. We all know district administration is the key, and people say in India, Prime Minister, Chief Minister, District Magistrate, they are the 3. PM, CM, DM are the who matter. But I have suggested to the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Engineering, why don't you, instead of training your IAS officers for district administration in a traditional mode, why don't you look at district as an economic unit? Now, I found it interesting. I told him 3 months ago. I find it interesting talking economic geography. So the training for district has to go like that. Now, talking of regulators, I'm talking, when I was member CCI, we gave a couple of orders and we said, asking BCCI, this is what's wrong with you. Please set up your own system which will satisfy you and just tell us. I think a lot of these things can be sorted out, and today we seem to have the kind of motivation, the kind of leadership, the kind of vision this is required. What we have to do after things like this? How to deliver the vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can go on with this conversation. There are several other questions that I would have liked to ask, but in the interest of time, and given that you are between me and lunch, I'll try and conclude very quickly by saying there's no doubt that we need a slew of reforms, reforms that will help execute projects better in this country, our ability to improve citizens' confidence in the delivery capabilities of the government, and also in the policy making processes. And a good place to start would be, like the panelists said, is to root for the common man and ensure that the rule of law and constitution is the underlying principle. So thank you. Amit, do we have time for a question or two?
Sorry. I'm sorry for that. We can't really go into Q&A right now. We are running behind schedule. But thanks a lot, Vinay, for really moderating the panel and doing a very exciting thing out of this.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you, everyone.
So, Chad, Mr. Charles Evans, can I have you here to actually honor my speakers, please? And Can we have a picture together, please? You're going to wake up. Thank you. Sure. I'm sorry, it just thanks a lot. So we are just open for lunch. Please join us for lunch now. We are going to come back bang at 2 o'clock. We are going to have an exciting session. And I'm sure that this is just heating up. We are going to have some exciting discussions towards the evening and closing with the speech by Mike Porter in the evening, please. Thank you. So.